Welcome back to Your Town. My name is Kierstyn Berlin. I'm continuing a conversation here with Theo Maehr. We spoke about, in the last segment, the Big Sur fires and your experience in that. And I really wanted to illustrate an example of where a thoughtful integrative design process really impacted an experience in dealing with the fires and dealing with the community. So you've been living off the grid for about 13 years, and you have quite a bit of water storage rain catch water storage in order to be able to do that, because you're not connected to a well or the creek there. So I'd like to finish the story about how that rain catch water system, because you have, how many tanks do you have? How many gallons?
Kierstyn, I think I have 13 tanks ranging from 500 gallons to 12,000 gallons.
Okay.
So my total storage is 60,000 gallons, and I'd actually like to up that a little bit more for these dry years, which we seem to be having right now. It was interesting, during the fire, I was the person on the ridge, the only person on the ridge that had a hydrant on the road that the fire personnel could hook their trucks into.
What do you mean, a hydrant? So you had a connection point on the road specifically for that?
Specifically for that, for
and did you
fire
put
service.
There?
What's that?
Did you put there, or?
Yes, I put it there.
That's
so
amazing.
I
didn't know that.
I had a 2-inch water line that I had run down to the road with a fitting on it so that any fire truck could easily come up to that and fill their water tank and do the firefighting that they needed to do. The cool thing about where I built, I have our main dirt road that's on the north side of my homes, my home and my barn, all my structures. Then my driveway wraps around all of that and comes back down to the main road. So I have a road that basically surrounds my structures and buildings, which is a wonderful, 12-foot wide area that doesn't burn.
Right.
The fire jumped the road and was burning below my orchard in some dry material. And CAL FIRE pulled one of their engines up into my driveway and ran hose out and used their tank full of water to put this fire out. And I went up to the engineer and I said, "Do you need to refill?" And he said, "Is it possible?" And I said, "Yes, I have a hydrant right down on the road.
In the middle of nowhere.
I'll get it ready for you." And his eyes just lit up and this smile came across his face to realize that he would be able to stay up on the ridge and continue to do the work that they needed to do. And the word got out to the other CAL FIRE engineers who were up there, and for the next 2 or 3 days they used my hydrant to fill their engines and backburn around everybody's place up there.
I hope you had enough water to live on after that.
I did have enough. It was amazing that I did. I borrowed a little bit of water from a neighbor, used 5,000 gallons from a neighbor. He had said when he left, "Theo, please, whatever you need, use." And so once CAL FIRE had drained my tanks, I was concerned. I hooked into his system because it was the easiest to get water back into a situation where if CAL FIRE needed it, they could use it. So interestingly, water is such a precious resource. And in California, we go through these many months of the year where there's no rainfall. It seems this year, 2020, we've already launched into summer. The landscape looks like it does usually in June or July.
I'm blossoming at my place right now. Yeah.
Big Sur River is way down. And all life needs water. Not only do we as people need water, not only do we need water to grow the crops that we grow, to grow the food that we like to have. Ideally, I think our water resources should be used for edible landscapes. And it is something that I have spent a lot of time creating on my property. Doing so, I have watched wildlife populations increase dramatically. I have an abundance of birds year-round that treat my space as an oasis. After the Sobranis fire, it was an amazing thing to wake up in the morning and that little island of unburned space was teeming with more wildlife than I had ever seen on it before. Birds had taken refuge there. We had an infestation of rodents, which I would have preferred not to have had, but they definitely found a safe refuge in that area. And really it's all because of water and the careful management of water resources. 60,000 gallons isn't a lot of water, but all of the water that I use for my household use besides flushing toilets is reused in a gray water system that then irrigates my orchard. I usually use fresh water for my garden.
You have a filtration system that's also a natural.
I do. My gray system is amazing. It's a living system.
Yeah.
And so the water goes through cattails, and then
there's fish in there too. Yes.
I have fish and frogs.
The kids always pull out the little tadpoles.
Since I put that system in, somehow or other, I don't know how frogs do it. Again, I'm at 2,700 feet. I'm like half a mile from the closest stream. And after about 5 years of having that gray water system in place, suddenly one spring I started to hear the spring peepers, and now they are so abundant up there. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And this is what really gives me hope, we have so much knowledge available to us. We have so much technology at our disposal. And we have such an ability to influence the environment in a positive way. I truly believe that if our focus was on stewardship as a planet, we would create the most heavenly planet to live on.
Yeah. So I want to just jump in, because in a conversation I had with Rob Carver, we were talking about how sometimes when I talk when I represent an environmentalist perspective, or when I talk to people in the environmentalist perspective, I feel like there's a kind of black and white thinking around development as sort of degradation, and so really I feel like you and I have this conversation a lot, and I feel like you are this wonderful embodiment of how development and building on a land can be a process of actually stewarding the land and actually enhancing not only the landscapes but the wildlife, and so this is also the business that you are offering the community is a consulting in stewarding the land, and you really are the best example of anyone I've ever seen come into a land and actually enhance it in great ways and in many ways, not just in cultivating life. You're living off of a lot of your own food that you grow up there. Can you tell me a little bit about the ecosystem that you've developed up there and the lifestyle that you're living and what that looks like?
Sure. The one thing that comes to mind as you're talking is community. And when you are on the land, the ideal is to build community, and that doesn't mean just with people, and it is really important to build a community with your neighbors, but to build community with all the life that surrounds you. You can't be greedy. If you're going to grow apricots, you better be growing enough for the scrub jays and the stellar jays and the ravens that want to come by and snack a little bit. I have watched thrashers come through and eat my stone fruit. And yet there's plenty still for me. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about our landscape, we don't think about it just for ourselves, but we think about how can I enhance this situation so that I have the joy of seeing these wild natural species that have as much right to live on this planet as we do, I want to see them thrive. I want to be able to wake up in the morning and hear their bird calls, to be able to watch as the little chipmunk, waves its tail on a piece of wood somewhere. So community is very important, and building that community up is key. If we don't know what our community is, we have no reason to care about it. As an educator who spent years as a Waldorf teacher and so much time in the classroom, I eventually got to the point I could not be in there anymore. I do not feel or believe that our young people or people in general should be spending so much time indoors. We need to be introduced to and know intimately these other life forms that inhabit the planet with us. Learn to love them, and in loving them, we're going to care for them.
So I want to jump in quickly and just give a little background, because you taught for 12 years in a classroom.
15.
15, okay.
Yes.
15 years, okay. And you have a master's degree from Stanford in education.
Master's in education.
In education, right.
And I also have Waldorf teacher training. And
right.
Yes.
And you and I have been having this conversation for a long time about how does an environment impact our how we educate our youth, how we educate even adults, right? How does our design of our environment impact that learning system? And that's a conversation that you and I are so passionate about.
So I was a homeschool teacher for one of those years, Big Sur charter school. It was my favorite year of teaching because I was dealing with children that had grown up on the land in Big Sur. They'd been homeschooled their entire lives. They woke up in the morning doing chores and integrating the landscape into their day. They chose what they were going to do, and most of them chose to spend a lot of time outside. The conversations I had with these young people, I will never forget. I believe it is in our entire genetic makeup that we are integrated with the landscape and the land. It is a feedback loop that takes place when you work with the land and you work with your hands and you get your hands dirty and you're out there with all of this life. It creates unity consciousness. I don't know how else to describe it. You realize that you're a part of something that's so much bigger than you are. And you realize you're dependent on this living system for your own life. I know that touching that soil in the morning or wood or whatever it is I'm doing, and if you look at my hands, they are not hands that sit and work at a desk.
Notorious hands, yeah.
But there's a communication that takes place. Research has shown recently that it's contact with the soil that creates endorphins in our body, that feel-good feeling that we all want to experience. To take this kind of thing away from our young people is a tragedy. These young people, given the opportunity to be outside, learn more than they can ever learn from a book by just observing the systems that are already in place. If you think of what is it that creates genius, it's being able to understand things without having anybody tell you about it. That's Einstein was doing this all the time.
Right.
And cognition has been shown to develop through free time spent in the out of doors. So our educational model needs to change dramatically. One should be oriented towards stewardship, which starts with care of the self and then goes out to care of the environment. It needs to be oriented to being outside as much as we possibly can. And we need to be paying our educators so that we have the most qualified, intelligent people educating our young people. If we had competent people educating our young people, they wouldn't need any training.
You know,
They would just be able to impart this wonderful, inspirational wisdom that would inspire these young people to do what they already want to do, which is learn, be connected, make a difference.
okay, so to be fair, we live in a community with a lot of opportunity for indoor-outdoor environments. Like we have our beautiful Carmel Middle School, Carmel High School, Carmel River School.
We have
some
Maehr.
gardens.
Yes.
We have Maehr, and we have a pretty conscious, I would say, board at the district as far as their
we have a great supervisor.
understanding of that and wanting to move in that direction. And there is some sort of bureaucratic tape always and a slow process in integrating what we find in research around children and education. And so one of the things that I was involved in the last year or so was part of the community meetings for the district, for Carmel, for their facilities master plan to redevelop it. And so they hired a company up in the Bay Area to, they had a couple people. They hired somebody who came in and first talked about, okay, how do we want to, before we redesign our schools, how do we want to reorient the way that we teach so that it's not this sort of, factory developed system that we have had and that we've carried into this century for whatever reason, where we have more outdoor, indoor, where we have more collaborative space, where we have more interaction with, gardens and landscapes and cooking and lab type settings, circle type of dynamics, or separating into, kids that are introverted and kids that are extroverted, being able to separate into different ways of learning, these kinds of education systems that exist already in other places. Notably Texas comes to mind, like they do this. Anyway, so I know that the district is aware, and so this conversation around because we can't design a building if we're designing a building to be like in the system that we've seen so far, it is fine the way it is. So how are we shifting how we see education, what actually works with education? I mean, you talk about connecting with the earth, but it's also, what I think people might hear that and they say, oh, that's just, how do we integrate that into an actual structure and system and foundation? But actually what I wanted to say about what you're saying is also you're impacting your health. The way that you eat is cleaner than anybody I know. The way that you understand your body and moving your body and self-care, it's not just about the chipmunks, it's also a very practical, healthy way when you're aware of the environment and how you're integrating with it, how you're designing within it, how you're building your structures within it, how you're creating your day-to-day life, how you're building those roads, right? All of those things are very practical, as well as also you're explaining that sense of deep connection that also occurs when you're doing that. That's part of that system.
I have a new words for this. I'd call it earth yoga or land yoga, because that's what it is, and you've described it quite well. It's just the benefits just are endless.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at research, we know it. We already know.
There's an interesting thing. We've unfortunately gotten rid of so many of the people that could have taught us how to educate. The indigenous people of the world still have it pretty together, and they definitely had it very much together, how to steward land. Mm-hmm. And we've annihilated so many of those people. But if we could ask them, I think they would be like, yes, you've got to get back, to some of those old ways. Mm-hmm. The man that I ended up first doing organic farming with, David Rosenberg, in Cincinnati, Ohio. He had a place called Wooden Shoe Gardens, and he had gotten his PhD in anthropology, had studied primitive cultures, and found that they spent 4 hours on average a day taking care of their survival needs, mm-hmm. working. Mm-hmm. The rest of the time,
a little less than we do.
The rest of the time they had to enjoy with their family, work on creative pastimes, observe nature, swim, walk. There's a big question mark for me. What have we created for ourselves?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're gonna wrap up this segment, and I just want to let people know about you and your services. So you're a Stewart consultant.
So I just have started a new business called the Earth Steward, and it's the Earth Steward Big Sur style.
And you can focus on a number of different categories.
House design and building, including Vastu homes, fire mitigation, education, and learning to be a steward of the land.
Okay. And do you have a website that people could?
I do have a building website, which is www.theearthsteward.com.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Theo, for joining us.
Thank
It's a
you,
pleasure.
Kierstyn.